Well, hello there, and welcome to the Good Old Days of Radio show. This is John Tefteller, your host. It is Thursday, and last week we started a new series. Thursday is when we normally do our kind of horror, sci-fi, weird stuff, and we're veering close to that, especially with today's episode. But we're going to do a special series on the great radio drama Suspense. We did one last week, and we'll be doing more. Today we have a really great one. This is one of my favorites of all time from Suspense. And we have a special guest, which we had last week, and we have again Dr. Joe Webb, who is the expert on Suspense. I don't think I'm going to go rolling through all his credits again. If you want to find out more about him, you can listen to last week's show. In fact, you better listen to last week's show so you can hear all this. You don't want to miss what we had for you last week. But just to say that Dr. Joe Webb is the authority on suspense and the author of the book on suspense, which you can get on Amazon. So there's your official plug to start the show. Dr. Joe, welcome back to the Good Old Days of Radio show. As I alluded to, we have one of the great ones of all time. Before I ask you about this, I just want to say I listened to this the other day, and I had heard this years ago, not from Pacific Pioneer Broadcasters. They did not have a copy of this in their archives. I got it someplace else, and it was, I think, an Armed Forces Radio Series version, and it wasn't particularly great sound. And normally I don't even listen to things like that, but I thought, well, Ronald Colman, I like him. This is supposed to be kind of a weird thing. I'll probably like it. And I remember playing it and going, oh, God, is this a great show? Why don't we have a nice crystal clear copy of this? Well, somehow the ravages of time over the last 40 years has produced a great sounding copy, because when I put this on yesterday, I'm like, oh, great. Finally I can hear this the way it was meant to be heard. So, welcome, Dr. Joe, to the Good Old Days of Radio show. It's your turn. Tell us about the Suspense move from the John Dixon Carr era, which is what we heard last week, to Hollywood and big-time stars.
Well, last week was that story, Will You Make a Bet with Death, by the mystery writer John Dixon Carr, who was hired by the series to give it credibility, but he was called for service, and then the U.S. agreed that he could go back to the U.K. to work on their war communications. So that basically ended the relationship that Suspense had with him. And in the meantime, William Spear was moving the show to Hollywood to get big stars and hopefully attract a sponsor, which they did. They attracted Roma Wines. And it was a very, very big change. The budget for, I believe that I had estimated on an inflation-adjusted basis that the show was running a budget in today's dollars of around $75,000 a week, which involved two productions, because they had East and West, the full orchestra with custom music, and some of the greatest radio actors in support of Hollywood stars who were not always good at radio acting. But Ronald Colman, who's in this episode, was. A lot of folks who start collecting radio programs first bump into Ronald Colman because of being the next door neighbor of Jack Benny. But here he is in a very in some cases, disturbing story called August Heat, which was from a 1910 short story adapted for this particular performance. One of the key persons in Suspense at this time is Robert Richards, who was the script editor under the direction of William Spear. Spear was an incredibly talented person who had started out as a music critic when he was actually in his late teens and early 20s, and he was a musician, and he could compose some things. So he had a great rapport with the orchestra, and knew how music could change moods of programs. And he had Richards, who was incredibly skilled as a writer and making adaptations or fixing scripts so they would fit better into the suspense mold. So the whole thing would work out very well, very cohesive. As you listen to more and more suspense, one of the things that you do realize that differentiates it so much from other radio programs is the music. And if you listen carefully to the bridges between scenes and what's playing in the background during some of the most important moments of the script, you start to get that appreciation. Now, this script, in addition to being edited by Robert Richards, was adapted from the short story by one of Hollywood's best scriptwriters, Mel Dinelli. Now, he did not rise in prominence until years after the show, but he wrote a screenplay called The Spiral Staircase, which is a very creepy and haunting movie and a terrific movie. But he also wrote some suspense scripts to Find Help, which was Frank Sinatra's appearance on the program, which became a movie called Beware My Lovely, and was also a stage play called The Man. So when he did To Find Help, he was still working on that concept that became very successful. Then a suspense script called Drive-In, which Judy Garland appeared on, and then another one with Joan Crawford called A Tale of Two Sisters. So he was in the suspense mold. Robert Richards would make it better. Spear would add the music direction and the like. So this is a lot of really top-notch people working on it. Spear loved this script very much, and he would later become a producer on Philip Morris Playhouse, and he would run it again. So it was something that he really, really enjoyed. The program was the publicity for the program changed the title to Summer Heat, but they changed it back to August Heat, and it's a great script. They did it a couple of times on the show. It's got it's got the Ronald Colman. Supporting him is Dennis Hoy, who was Inspector Lestrade in the Basil Rathbone Sherlock Holmes movies, and also in the cast is Peggy Ray, who was trying to get an acting career going. She was William Spear's secretary. And then, of course, the signature voice here is Joe Kearns. And I grew up knowing him as Mr. Wilson, who lived next door to Dennis the Menace.
Right. A lot of people know him from that.
Yes, and they don't realize what an incredible radio career he had. When you lay it all out from the beginning from his earliest years in Salt Lake City, in the development of the technology and acting techniques and the like, Kearns is somehow there all the time. So he's a key person in, if you want to call it, the suspense ecosystem all through the 1940s, as an announcer, as an actor, doubling and tripling, doing dialects and the like. So we'll hear him here in this as the signature voice of suspense.
Okay, and so those of you who like the Thursday kind of creepy horror type programs, this one is going to veer about as close to that as we're going to get. It's a very strange, interesting story. August Heat from May 31st, 1945. Here we go.
Now, the Roma Wine Company of Fresno, California presents Suspense.
Tonight, Roma Wines bring you the distinguished actor, Mr. Ronald Colman, in one of the great suspense stories of our time, August Heat.
Suspense is presented for your enjoyment by Roma Wines. That's R-O-M-A, Roma Wines. Those excellent California wines that can add so much pleasantness to the way you live, to your happiness in entertaining guests, to your enjoyment of everyday meals. Before we bring you Ronald Colman and our suspense play, here's a brief message from Elsa Maxwell, famed for her great charm as a hostess.
When food looks appetizing, it almost always lives up to expectations. When even so simple a main dish as a steaming, fragrant bowl of spaghetti or beans is surrounded by bright green salads, golden rolls or muffins, and brilliant Roma California burgundy, the food is more enjoyable, more delightful.
And for a summery touch of the outdoors, a vase of flowers. Perfect color complement to the deep, rich beauty of Roma burgundy. You'll enjoy the fruity, robust taste, the tart piquancy of distinguished Roma burgundy served cool. Truly a masterpiece of fine winemaking. Like all Roma wines, Roma burgundy is unvaryingly good, always high in quality of bouquet, color, and taste. The happy reward of selected grapes, brought slowly to perfection, gently pressed, then carefully guided to flavor fullness by the ancient skill of Roma's noted wineries in California's choicest vineyards. Yet all this goodness is yours for only pennies a glass. Remember, more Americans enjoy Roma than any other wine. Roma, Roma wines. Yes, right now a glassful would be very pleasant, as Roma wines bring you a remarkable tale of suspense.
And with August Heat, W.F. Harvey's matchless narrative of premonition and the brooding terror of twilight and the unseen, and with the performance of Ronald Colman, Roma Wines hope indeed to keep you in suspense.
Peniston Road, Clapham, August the 20th, 1945. I have had what I believe to be the most remarkable day in my life. And while the events are still fresh in my mind, I wish to put them down on paper as clearly as possible. Let me say at the outset that my name is James Clarence Withencroft. You must remember that in order to have the full implication of my story. James Clarence Withencroft. I'm 40 years old, in perfect health, never having known a day's illness. By profession, I'm an artist. Not a very successful one, but I earn enough money by my black and white work to satisfy my necessary wants. My only near relative, a sister, died 5 years ago, so that there is no one in particular to whom I address this manuscript. Only you, who might by chance read it someday. For because of the peculiar circumstance about which you will soon hear, I have the strong premonition that I shall never live to tell anyone about it. I breakfasted this morning at 9 at the usual time. It was no different from any other morning, and after glancing through the morning paper, I lighted my pipe, and I proceeded to let my mind wander in the hope that I might chance upon some subject for my pencil. The room, though door and window were open, was oppressively hot, and I had just made up my mind that the coolest and most comfortable place in the neighborhood would be the deep end of the public swimming bath, when I was suddenly shaken. A feeling swept over me such as I'd never experienced before. I attempted to rise to my feet, but somehow it seemed as though I had suddenly been fastened to my chair. My hand went out in an effort to brace myself. And then, before I knew what I was doing, my pencil was in my hand, and I began to draw. It was as though someone had taken my hand and was moving it across the paper, swiftly, in bold strokes. And then I seemed to take over. My hand, under its own power, began to draw. I soon forgot the oppressive heat. Everything was forgotten in this frantic feeling that the sketch must be finished as soon as possible. I had no idea how long I worked until I heard the clock of St. Jude's in the distance. It was 4 o'clock, and I had started just after breakfast. Now, for the first time since I'd begun, I actually seemed to see what I had been sketching. I was surprised. The final result was, I felt sure, the best thing I'd ever done. It showed a criminal in the dock, immediately after the judge had pronounced sentence. The man was fat, enormously fat. The flesh hung in rolls about his chin. It creased his huge, stumpy neck. He was clean-shaven, or perhaps I should say a few days before he must have been clean-shaven, and he was almost bald. He stood there before the judge, his short, clumsy fingers clasping the rail, looking straight in front of him. The feeling that his expression conveyed was not so much one of horror as of utter, absolute collapse. There seemed nothing in the man strong enough to sustain that mountain of flesh. And then I saw that the sketch wasn't complete, for the man's other hand seemed to be clutching an instrument of some kind, a weapon, but it hadn't been completed. I had made this sketch, and yet I had no recollection of what I'd intended the man to carry in his other hand. I took up my pencil again, and I attempted to fill in the fuzzy outline, but it was useless. It was as though my fingers had suddenly turned to lead. I sat down, and I felt the moisture slowly forming on my forehead. And once again I was conscious of the oppressive heat. Then I knew that there would be no finishing of the sketch. At any rate, not for the moment. So I rolled it up, and without quite knowing why, I put it in my pocket. In spite of my peculiar inspiration, I was filled with a rare sense of happiness which the knowledge of a good thing well done gives. I believe that I set out with the idea of calling upon Trenton, for I remember walking along Lytton Street and turning to the right along Gilchrist Road at the bottom of the hill where the men are at work on the new tram lines. From there onwards, I have only the vaguest recollection of where I went. Through parks, along crowded streets, always conscious of the awful heat that came up from the dusty asphalt pavement in a suffocating wave. And I remember, too, the hollow sound of my footsteps as I moved along. Although walking aimlessly, I somehow knew that there was a goal, a something to which I was drawn. I longed for the thunder promised by the great banks of copper-colored clouds that hung low over the western sky. I've really no idea how far I walked when a small boy roused me from my abstraction.
Got the time, mister?
20 minutes to 7.
Thanks. Hot enough for you, sir?
Yes. When he left me, I began to take stock of my bearings. I found myself standing before a gate that led into a yard bordered by a strip of thirsty earth. There were flowers, purple stock and scarlet geranium, and great numbers of bees droned over them. I stood looking down at them for a moment, and then for some reason I looked up. Over the entrance to the place, there was a board with the inscription, Charles Atkinson, Monumental Mason, worker in English and Italian marbles. From the yard itself came a cheery whistle, the noise of hammer blows, and the cold sound of steel meeting stone. A sudden impulse made me enter, and I went in the direction of the noise. There was a man, sitting with his back towards me. He was busy at work on a slab of curiously veined marble. Then, without turning, his hammer stopped in midair as he was about to bring it down on his chisel. He held this position a moment before turning, but I knew that he was aware of my presence, and when he turned, I saw his face. It was, although I'd never seen him before, it was the face of the man I had been drawing. Yes, it was the face of the man whose sketch was in my pocket. He sat there on his low stool, huge and elephantine, the sweat pouring from his scalp, not speaking. Then he took a red silk handkerchief and he mopped his brow. Although this face that looked up at me was the same as my sketch, the expression was absolutely different. Suddenly the puzzled expression left his face, and he smiled, as if we were old friends, and he walked over and he took my hand.
Good day, sir.
Good day. I'm sorry to intrude.
Not at all.
Everything is so hot and glary outside. This is like an oasis in the wilderness.
I don't know about an oasis, but it certainly is hot. Take a seat, sir.
He pointed to the end of the gravestone on which he was at work, and I sat down.
Very hot.
That's a beautiful piece of stone you've got hold of.
In a way, it is. Surface here is as fine as anything you could wish. But there's a big flaw at the back, though I don't expect you'd ever notice it.
Oh, I shouldn't think so.
I could never really do a good job of a bit of marble like this. It'd be all right in the summer like this. It wouldn't mind the blasted heat. But wait till the winter comes.
Winter?
There's nothing quite like frost to find out the weak points in stone.
Oh.
Gravestone, you see.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
Then what's this one for?
You'd hardly believe me if I was to tell you it's for exhibition, but it's the truth. Artists have exhibitions, so do grocers and butchers. Well, we have them too. All the latest little things in headstones, you know.
He went on to talk of marbles, which sort of marble best withstood wind and rain, and which were easiest to work. Then of his garden, and some new sort of carnation he had bought. At the end of every other minute, he would drop his tools, wipe his shining head.
This heat's bad. A man's not responsible for what he does in this heat.
I said little, for I felt uneasy. There was something unnatural, uncanny in all of this. A feeling that I'd experienced it all before. The oppressive heat, the fragrance of the stocks in the air, the conversation about the marble, the flowers, everything as though I'd experienced it before. And yet I knew that I'd never been in this section of the town before. I tried to persuade myself that at least I had seen him before, that his face, unknown to me, had found a place in some out-of-the-way corner of my memory. But I knew that I was practicing little more than a plausible piece of self-deception. As I sat there quietly, watching him, he looked up at me and he said,
There. What do you think of that?
He said it with an air of evident pride, of a job well done. I could sense that he was experiencing the same feeling I had experienced when I'd finished my sketch. Then he got up with a sigh of relief.
Hot. Hot, ain't it?
I was seated in such a position that I was unable to see his work, and for some reason I didn't move. Suddenly, he began to read what he'd carved on the tombstone. He spoke deliberately and with a flat voice.
In the midst of life, we are in death. Born January 18th, 1905.
I looked up with a start. This man had read my exact birth date.
He passed away very suddenly on August 20th, 1945.
That's today.
We usually use the present date on these exhibition stones.
Do you usually put a name on them, too?
Yes. Sacred to the memory of James Clarence Withencroft.
A cold shudder swept over me, and I sat there in silence. The sound of birds and crickets seemed loud in my ears. As we stood there, looking at each other, saying nothing. And then he mopped his brow again.
Hot. Hot.
I was finally able to speak. Where did you see that name?
Huh? Oh, I didn't see it anywhere. I wanted some name, and I put down the first one that came into my head.
Strange coincidence, but it happens to be mine.
Huh? That's your name? You're James Clarence...
Withencroft, yes.
Whoa. And the dates?
I can only answer for the birth date. It's correct.
Oh, that's a rum go.
I made a sketch this morning of you.
Of me? But you've never seen me before.
No.
Oh. Oh.
I took my sketch from my pocket and I showed it to him. As he looked, the expression on his face altered until it became more and more like that of the man I had drawn.
And it was only the day before yesterday that I told Maria there were no such things as ghosts.
Neither of us had seen a ghost, but I knew what he meant. Then I spoke to him. You probably heard my name someplace.
Yes, you must have seen me somewhere. I've forgotten it.
Yes.
Were you at Clacton on Sea last July?
No. No, I've never been to Clacton in my life.
Oh.
Then we were silent for some time again, and we stood there looking at one another and at the two dates on the gravestone. And the birth one was right, and the other was today.
Well, come inside and have some supper.
His wife was a strange little woman who was pallid with the look of those who live their lives indoors. Her husband introduced me as a friend of his who was an artist, and he informed her that I was staying to supper. I spoke, making some comment that I hoped I wouldn't be an intrusion, and she looked up at me and she said,
"You have a pleasing voice, Mr. Withencroft, and you're welcome in my home. I'm sorry Charles has not brought you here before."
Very little was said during the meal, and after the sardines and watercress had been removed, she walked over to a cupboard and she took down a thin black book, and as she handed it to me, she spoke.
"Would you read aloud, Mr. Withencroft?"
Puzzled, I looked down at the book which she'd opened and placed before me. It was a very tiny book. The Prophet, it was called, by an author unknown to me with a strange Eastern name. Khalil Gibran. And my eyes fell across the page, and suddenly I was reading, aloud, as she'd asked me to. Then Almitra spoke, saying, "We would ask now of death." And he said, "You would know the secret of death. But how shall you find it unless you seek it in the heart of life? The owl, whose night-bound eyes are blind unto the day, cannot unveil the mystery of light. If you would indeed behold the spirit of death, open your heart wide unto the body of life. For life and death are one, even as the river and the sea are one. In the depth of your hopes and desires lies your silent knowledge of the beyond. And like seeds dreaming beneath the snow, your heart dreams of spring. Trust the dreams, for in them is hidden the gate to eternity. Your fear of death is but the trembling of the shepherd when he stands before the king whose hand is to be laid upon him in honor. Is the shepherd not joyful beneath his trembling? that he shall wear the mark of the king? Yet is he not more mindful of his trembling? For what is it to die but to stand naked in the wind and to melt into the sun? And what is it to cease breathing but to free the breath from its restless tides, that it may rise and expand and seek God unencumbered? Only when you drink from the river of silence shall you indeed sing. And when you have reached the mountain top, then you shall begin to climb. And when the earth shall claim your limbs, then shall you truly dance. When I looked up, Mr. Atkinson had gone. But his wife stood before me, and as she took the book, she spoke.
Thank you.
Then I went outside, and I found Atkinson sitting on the gravestone and smoking. He looked up at me.
Hot. Man's not responsible for what he might do in this heat. She's never asked anyone to read aloud before.
And then we talked about the sketch again. He looked at it.
Well, like this is me, all right. On trial?
You must excuse my asking, but do you know of anything you've done for which you could be put on trial?
No, I've done nothing. Not yet.
He got up, fetched a can from the porch, and he began to water the flowers.
Twice a day regular in the hot weather. And then the heat sometimes gets the better of the delicate ones, and ferns, good Lord, they could never stand it. Where'd you live?
I told him my address. It would take an hour's quick walk to get back home. Then he stopped watering, and he faced me squarely.
It's like this. We look at the matter straight. If you go back home tonight, you take your chance of accidents. A cart may run over you. There's always banana skins and orange peels, to say nothing of falling ladders.
He spoke of the improbable with an intense seriousness that would have been laughable 6 hours before. But I did not laugh.
The best thing we can do is for you to stay here till 12 o'clock. Then it'll be tomorrow, do you see?
Yes.
We'll go upstairs and smoke. It may be cooler inside.
And to my surprise, I agreed. We are sitting in a long, low room beneath the eaves. Atkinson has sent his wife to bed. He himself is busy sharpening some tools at a little oilstone, smoking one of my cigars the while. And as I look at my sketch before me, I suddenly see the fuzzy outline of what the man in the picture holds in his hands. While I had not been able to sketch it before, I am able to do so now. It is a chisel, and it is stained with dark liquid. The sketch is completed now. The air seems charged with thunder, and I hear it in the distance. It is ominous, but it carries the hope of rain. Perhaps this damnable heat will be broken soon, and the day will soon be over. It is close to 12. I am writing this at a shaky table before the open window. The leg is cracked, and Atkinson, who seems a handy man with his tools, is going to mend it as soon as he has finished putting an edge on his chisel. It is 12. The day is over. and I shall be going home. But the heat is stifling. This heat is enough to send a man mad.
And so closes August Heat, in which Roma Wines have brought you Ronald Colman as star of tonight's study in Suspense. Suspense is produced, edited, and directed by William Spear. Music for August Heat was composed by Lucian Morawick and conducted by Lud Gluskin. Dennis Hoy appeared as Atkinson.
Before Mr. Coleman returns to the microphone, this is Truman Bradley with a word for Roma Wines, the sponsor of Suspense. America's famed authority on hospitality, Elsa Maxwell, recently made this suggestion for gracious entertaining.
Your friends will respect your good taste when you serve delightful Roma California Tokay. Enjoyable at any time, with coffee or dessert, with nuts and fruit. I suggest serving Roma Tokay cool.
A most timely suggestion from Miss Maxwell. You'll find flame-bright Roma Tokay velvety smooth, moderately sweet, light, yet delightfully rich in color. And you'll find Roma wines always delicious, of unvarying fine quality and goodness. June is the month of weddings, and the most distinguished way to fate the June bride is by serving Roma California champagne. Its gold and sparkle and delicious, delightful dryness tell you that here is a truly fine champagne, Roma champagne. Next time you plan for a special occasion, add this sparkling touch of perfection. Good Roma champagne.
This is Ronald Colman. It was certainly a great pleasure to make my first appearance on Suspense, especially in one of my favorite stories, and I hope I'll be invited again. Now, if you'll permit me, I have a most important word. As the battle lines approach the heart of the Japanese homeland, the fighting grows fiercer, more costly in men, material, and money. Every one of us must back this mighty Seventh War Loan. Another reason, this is really two drives in one. So buy twice as much as last year and buy those war bonds now. Thank you.
Next Thursday, you will hear John Payne and Frank McHugh as stars of Suspense.
Presented by Roma Wines, R-O-M-A, made in California for enjoyment throughout the world. This is CBS, the Columbia Broadcasting System.
Well, there you have it. August Heat, presented to you in the dead of winter on the Good Old Days of Radio show. Of course, it depends on when you're listening to this. You could be listening to this in August. It depends. It'll be on the internet forever. Once you put it on the internet, it never goes away. It's always there. Anyway, August Heat with Ronald Colman and Dennis Hoey. Interesting to me, Dennis Hoey here, he's known primarily, as you mentioned earlier, for his role as Inspector Lestrade in the Basil Rathbone, Nigel Bruce, Sherlock Holmes radio series, as well as the films. He's playing a very, shall we say, obese person in this role on Suspense, and yet in real life he was not obese at all. And if you watch any of the Sherlock Holmes films, you can see him. He's not obese at all, but he does a great job with his voice convincing you that he's this huge obese man carving into stone. Anyway.
It's the magic of radio, John.
Yes, it's the magic of radio. Okay. Dr. Joe, tell us any more you want about August Heat, and then we will say goodbye for this week.
At the end of the program, there was a pitch for the 7th War Loan Drive, and many people don't know what that was about. We were still involved in World War II. Victory in Europe Day was a couple of weeks before, but we were still involved in Japan. And they were using these, basically we would know them today as savings bonds, to raise money to pay for the war, and to basically have people lend money to the government to pay for the war. So that's what that was. And all of the war drives had very, very big support and activities by Hollywood. So if you go through all the different war drives, and you can hear different pitches for them on programs, and also special live events that were broadcast, you will hear some of the luminaries of Hollywood helping out at that time.
Oh, yeah. The U.S. government did a great job of inserting itself in network radio and giving lots of hurrahs and hoorays for the war effort. And that contributed greatly into keeping the public roused up and still interested in fighting the Germans and the Japanese, when they might have tired of it a lot quicker had it not been for all the rah, rah, rah on the radio almost every day. Okay. So there we go. That was August Heat. This is the Good Old Days of Radio show with our special guest, Dr. Joe Webb, the suspense expert and author of the book, The Suspense Companion, which you can find on Amazon.com. We will be back next week with another episode of this Best of Suspense series, and we'll be back on Tuesday with comedy, drama, or variety, depending on what we pick, which we never know until we walk in the studio and do it, usually.
Yeah. Now, next week is one of the strangest episodes of Suspense ever.
Yeah. All right, and I'm going to tell a little story about that one next week. Until then, this is John Tefteller and the Good Old Days of Radio show saying goodbye.